Grampian Nation, welcome back. We have such a rare treat for you today. Peggy Grande served as the executive assistant for President Ronald Reagan during a whole bunch of years while he was back in California. And I am just so thrilled and touched that she would choose our show. She's an author, a keynote speaker, and just an all around good person.
In 2013, I coined the name Grampian, and I gave it to your host, Jim Tracy.
Peggy, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me on. It's really a pleasure, and thanks for reaching out.
Oh, my goodness. I have to tell you, as I look back, I graduated from college in 1983. And so in 84, I was able to buy a house because interest rates went from like 18 to 13%. And I give credit to that to our Gipper, President Reagan. So tell us a little bit about, you wrote a book, and I'm going to just highlight it right here because I bought it and I read it, and then I went and got the audio book. So the name of the book is The President Will See You Now. How many times did you actually use that?
Probably hundreds, if not thousands. I consider myself to be such a lucky woman. I had the privilege of sitting right outside Ronald Reagan's office door every day for 10 years, serving as his executive assistant in the post-presidency. So from 1989 to 1999, I said that hundreds, if not thousands of times, and never imagining it would be the title of a book someday, but it seemed very appropriate.
But what an appropriate title for the book. Yeah. And when you started the book, you started in the book begins in a little bit of a shock for me because you began with Nancy Reagan.
Right. Well, she was an integral part, obviously, of his life. And I wanted to tell his story in a way that it ends in the way that we think that it should, with the ending of his life and then the beginning of the Reagan legacy as it's written after he's physically gone from us. But I certainly wanted to capture Mrs. Reagan, the importance of her life with his and the importance of her life with my life. And so even though I served President Reagan for 10 years, he lived for 15 years that I stayed connected to him. And Mrs. Reagan passed away after 27 years of my life intersecting hers. And so I wanted to give credibility and credence and gratitude to all 27 of those years. So the book begins at the very end, 27 years after I met the Reagans. And then it sort of starts back at the beginning of where I met them and met him, started working for him. And then 10 years later, say goodbye to him in a professional capacity, but 15 years later, say goodbye to him personally.
And the book, and hopefully I'm not giving too much away, but because folks, I really think you should read this book. But the fact is that there's so much raw emotion packed into that first chapter. It must have been very difficult to come up with an opening like that.
It was, I didn't know how I was going to start the book, and I certainly didn't know how I was going to end the book. But when Mrs. Reagan passed away, I made a very long, I guess back in the day, it probably would have been a Facebook post talking about some of the emotions I was feeling and not only saying goodbye to her, but really it was the finale at the end of the Reagan era because, her and him always were seen as being together. So saying goodbye to her really evoked and brought up so many of those emotions I had saying goodbye to him. And so it really started with that Facebook post. And my editor said, I think that's how you start. And so we had been trying to figure out a way to start at the end and then make it make sense. And so that's just kind of how it came to be. But there were a lot of things about the book that I think just played out the way that they should have, even though I never really knew exactly how it was going to play out. My editor always said, just surrender to the process and you'll know when you get there. And so especially as it came to the end of the book, I thought, I don't know how this book is going to end. And he said, surrender to the process and you'll know. And truly, when I got to the end, I did know. And to your point, tears on the keyboard and a lot of emotions poured into, especially those final few chapters in the book.
Yeah. And the process is painful because I'm working on my fourth book right now, and you have to surrender to the process, but that doesn't mean it's fun all the time.
You do, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the things that was so poignant about the book was you developed a picture of a family that kind of surrounded and in a lot of ways protected the Reagans, not from just from unwanted stuff. Can you talk about before you jump into President Reagan, the bond that you have with the staff that you worked with for those two?
Yeah. Well, you have to picture that when President Reagan was in the White House, he had hundreds, if not thousands, of people surrounding him all the time. One day he's president of the United States, and the next day he's a private citizen back in Los
Yeah,
Angeles. And there's a handful of people around him. And so he came back, obviously, to LA in January. I started working for him about 6 or 7 months later. But even when he very first left office, there was just a handful of people. So when I started working for him, there was maybe 12 or 15 of us. So we all wore a lot of hats, and we were very protective of him, if that's the right word. We wanted him to be served in the way that he deserved. We had that reverence and respect for the fact that he had very recently been president of the United States, and not just a good president, but a giant among greats.
yeah,
And so we had this desire to not let his life and his legacy suffer on our watch. And so it was a ferocious and tenacious group of people that did everything we possibly could to make sure that his legacy was protected. His life, of course, working very closely with Secret Service, was still maintained to be safe. But just that he was comfortable and felt like his
yeah,
vice presidency years weren't a big letdown after
yeah,
having left the White House.
yeah. And it seems to me that the process of becoming the non-president, it would be incredibly difficult, but he handled it with such dignity and out of and really respect for the office. When we first talked, I said, "This is the president who never removed his jacket in the Oval Office because he held such reverence for the position. He
Yeah.
never assumed that he should have been president."
He had a sense of gratitude always. He knew
Mhm.
that he always was going to be a temporary steward of that role. And it wasn't about him, it was about the American people who had elected him. And so, at the end of his 8 years, even if you asked him what he was most proud of, it wasn't policies that he implemented or things that he did. He said, "The thing I'm most proud of is that I made the American people believe in themselves again." And
Yeah,
so, what a great example of leadership. It's not about the leader, but it's about the people that they lead. And he
mhm,
always was mindful of the privilege and the honor of serving as president of the United States, and didn't think of himself as better than anybody. He just felt like he was doing the role that God had called him to do, and that God had opened the pathway for him to serve in. And if you were doing what God had called you to do and the ways you had been called to serve, then we were all equal. And so he
yeah.
really just did have a very humble view of his role, even though we always had that respect of who he was and how he had served.
Yeah, and when you talk about it in the book, you speak about um, getting to know President Reagan while you were like in junior high, and and you had a reverence, but also felt that that you were now maybe a bit safer after the transition to making climate.
Yeah, I think any of us who grew up maybe in the 80s, I was in junior high and high school primarily when he was president of the United States. I remember vividly the day that he was shot. And growing up, those were
Mm,
my very formative years when I really started paying attention to the world beyond my small town, and even having an acknowledgement of the president of the United States and listening to him on the news and watching his speeches and things. And I guess I thought that all presidents are like that, and soon
yeah,
realized as an adult that all presidents are not created equal. But there was a certain way about Ronald Reagan. And of course, we know he was a great communicator, but he had a way of communicating in a way that made us all feel part of those words. And it was almost like a call to action. And those of us who remember in the 1980s, he would come from the Oval Office through the camera into your living room on one of those big square, 3 dial channel
yeah,
TVs. But there was a connection, even though he was
yeah,
3,000 miles away from this young woman in Southern California. I was riveted by him. And it felt like he was talking just to me, and that when he talked about America in these glowing ways and painted this picture of how America could do and be better, I almost felt like that was a call to action, that I
Mm-hmm.
was invited to be part of it. And I think that that's how a lot of people felt. And so under the 80s, amazing things happened, not just because he was president of the United States, but he created a new vision for what America could be and how we could be the best of ourselves and as a nation. And we
Mm-hmm.
all bought into that. We believed it, and we did our best to be part of making that vision for America come true.
And you talk about that a bit in the book, and the way it felt like on inauguration day, everything changed, even though nothing changed other than 152 hostages to release. Um, but other than that, it was just a positive force that came through a calm demeanor. And and when I say a positive force, I want to say a positive force of optimism. Did that carry through every day?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you saw was what you got. And you're right. Those of us who remember the 1970s, taxes were high, inflation was high, unemployment was high, and American morale was incredibly low. Reagan takes office, and on day one, he starts talking about America in entirely different terms. It's morning in America.
Yeah.
America's best days are ahead. So he paints a new vision for what and who we can be as Americans. And in reality, on day one or two of the Reagan presidency, nothing had changed. Taxes were still high, inflation was still high, unemployment was still high. But the vision had changed. And so it reminds you as a leader the power of your words, the power of the language that you used. You set a pace and a tempo and a vision for something better and different for the people that you lead. And if you do that well, they're going to buy into that and believe that and follow that and be enthused by that.
We automatically became a shining city on a hill, didn't we?
We did. And we did it
Wow.
together.
And we did it together. And there are pictures of Ronald Reagan, and he's enjoying the company of Tip O'Neill. Wouldn't that be something that would be wonderful and welcome these days?
Yeah, and it wasn't
Yeah.
that he, had this Pollyanna attitude that everybody was always going to agree about everything, but he was a happy warrior. He didn't let the naysayers dictate the direction he took or the words and the language that he used. He always looked for ways that we had commonality. And rather than highlighting our differences, he started with the things we'd agreed upon and used that as a building block for moving forward. I mean, perfect example, his relationship with Gorbachev. He said
Yeah.
that he was over the evil empire. They were destined for the ash heap of history. I mean, these are not words that you say to a friend. And
Yeah.
yet you look at what happens. He backs Gorbachev basically into a corner. But when he could have gone for the kill, he gives him really, in a lot of ways, a graceful exit, an olive
Hmm.
branch of friendship, of dignity. And he allows Gorbachev to exit in a way where Reagan won. The wall
Yeah.
came down.
Yeah.
Communism was all but defeated in Eastern Europe for a time, but he extended then the hand of friendship. And so post presidency, it was almost surreal seeing this man who had been the face of the evil empire. Ronald Reagan's welcoming to him to his library and up to his ranch to spend personal time with him. And you think Reagan just had such a different view of diplomacy. It wasn't
Hmm.
something for the State Department or the Foreign Service. It looked a lot like friendship. And it was
Yeah.
with people who had been adversaries like Gorbachev, and also, of course, with longtime friends like Margaret Thatcher and leaders from all around the world, Helmut Kohl, Prime Minister Nakasone, Lech Walesa from Poland, you name it, they came through the
Yeah.
office post presidency because they had a friendship with Ronald Reagan. It wasn't just for diplomatic or protocol reasons. They cared about him as a person, and they knew that he cared about them.
Yeah. You tell a story in the book about Prime Minister Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, going up to the ranch. Can you relay that to the folks? They get a little flavor of your book.
Yeah, I don't know exactly which story you're talking about, but I will tell you that he had a wonderful relationship with Margaret Thatcher, and it was very personal. And even Mrs. Reagan also had a great relationship with her, and she had a very dry wit and a very funny sense of humor. And she knew she was funny, and she knew she could say something very deadpan with a straight face and get Ronald Reagan to just double over in laughter. And so it was very fun to watch their relationship, not just as political allies and soulmates in a lot of ways politically,
Yeah.
but to really watch that friendship and just the deep care that they had for each other as people, not just as politicians.
And that extended far beyond the presidency, didn't it?
It did. And because I worked for President Reagan post presidency. So
Hmm.
growing up, I grew up in Southern California, was a nerdy little kid that loved presidents and politics, but lived 3,000 miles from Washington, D.C. How would a woman like that ever cross paths with the political arena? But my dad raised me to believe somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as
Yeah.
well be you. So I took a chance in college as a communications major and wrote a letter to the great communicator who had just left the White House and returned to Los Angeles to open his post presidency office, and went in for an interview, thought I would, potentially be hired for an internship. Was hired not only for an internship, but when that internship ended, then I stayed serving him for the next 10 years as his executive assistant, sitting right outside his office door every day. So getting a chance to meet with these world leaders and former presidents and sitting presidents who came after him, and to see the respect he had for them, and then the reverence and respect that they had for him in return, was truly a front row seat to history.
Yeah. And as time went on, um, the popularity of presidents somehow seems to decrease, but his didn't, did it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think when you kicked the tires, you realized that they still held air. There wasn't this fake veneer that was on the top of Ronald Reagan. And once the shiny wore off, you saw that it was dull underneath. What you saw Ronald Reagan in public was exactly the person that he was in private. And to your point, there's a lot of people we put on a pedestal, and then you meet them and you think,
Mhm.
well, it was a little disappointing. Ronald Reagan was truly one of those rare people that, regardless of the pedestal you had already put him on, when you met him, he was that good or even better in person. And I think it was because he was very comfortable in who he was and who he wasn't. He had
Mhm.
great respect for the American people, for other people, and just treated everybody with just a genuine kindness and respect. Every single
Mhm.
person got that attention, full attention. He'd look
Yeah.
them in the eye. He would smile at them with this little twinkle and spark in his eye. And for that moment, you felt seen by Ronald Reagan. You felt like you mattered to him. And he had this wonderful way of connecting with people. And so he did that to every single person and never missed a moment to give that person their special moment with
Yeah.
him. And to watch that time and time again, I mean, what an incredible skill set, especially in a world of politics that can be so transactional. He never
Yeah.
lost the people behind the politics.
One of the things that I love is a book called Reagan in His Own Hand, and it goes through, it looks at all the speeches that he actually wrote on the little 4x6 cards that were
Yeah.
in his shirt pocket. And so, as a keynote speaker, I've adopted a lot of those strategies because I think it's easier in his own words to tell a story because you were there and nobody else can dispute it.
Well, it
Um,
was amazing. Oh, go ahead.
no, please.
I was going to say it was amazing, these little cards that he had, because before you could do a Google search and say, oh, what was that quote and who was that by? He had this little card catalog that they're like little recipe card books almost. And he would flip through them. He knew exactly where everything was. And he had written hundreds, if not thousands, of quotes on dozens and dozens and dozens of cards in these little books. But he would flip through them. It was like his Google search. But the interesting thing about that is, when you read through a lot of those cards, there was a lot of them you knew why he had written that down, and it made sense, and it very much aligned with things that you knew Ronald Reagan would say or think. But the most interesting part was there was definitely some quotes in there that you thought, why would he put this in there? Or this isn't what he agrees with, or he would never say this. But he realized that in order to put together a coherent argument against something, you had to know what they would say. And so there was a
Mm.
lot of things in there that you thought, wow, I know he doesn't believe that, but he didn't believe that, but he wanted to understand their argument and their point of view so that he could craft and create a counter argument. And I thought that was just brilliant because so often
Oh yeah.
we don't want to hear the opposing side. Don't tell me, I don't want to hear it. I just want to make my point. But instead, he really wanted to not only hear, but really understand opposing points of views because that helped him create his persuasive argument for the things that he believed in and advocated for.
Well, and when you craft those arguments, you begin to understand. And one of the things that when I watch President Reagan in retrospect, he was listening much more than he was talking. Is that a hallmark that you saw?
Definitely. And, we picture him as this very funny, gregarious person on the world stage, and he certainly was that. But behind the scenes, he was fairly quiet and introverted, and some might say shy. That was his natural nature of who
Mhm.
Ronald Reagan was. But he could definitely, as an actor, as a politician, he could turn that other side on. But really, behind the scenes, he was very thoughtful. He read a lot. He wrote a lot. He worked on draft upon draft upon draft of a speech, getting it just right.
Mhm.
And so people never really saw that side of him because he presented in this very public facing, warm, gregarious side. But I think he did the hard work behind the scenes so that he could show up, so that he could feel like it was very genuine, that he had studied so hard he didn't have to, read every single word of a speech. He had worked it through it enough that he could show up and be very present and connect
Mhm.
with the people around him and not be focused on making his point because he had already studied and done the work behind the scenes. And so I think people would be surprised to know how much he worked and studied and read and reworked speeches because he wanted to be able to show up in a way that was fully present.
Yeah. And anybody who's ever been on a stage would know that if you have a group in front of you that's more than 100 people, all of a sudden those spotlights come on and there is no grace left. So you have to do the work in advance. But what it sounds like is he did the work mentally rather than like a performance based rehearsal.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't standing up and just practicing rote, memorizing or practicing a speech, although he did very much have a photographic memory. And
Uh-huh.
I think if if the prompter ever went down, I mean, he would go off the cuff and just mastered it beautifully. And sometimes that was the most commented on or most remembered lines of the speech. But he didn't have to present one argument or one point of view to one audience and something to another. He never check which way the political winds were blowing to determine what he was going to say. He was so confident and sure of himself, who he was and what he believed in, that he could show up in a very true and transparent, authentic way all the time because it
Yeah.
didn't change based on the audience he was speaking to.
Yeah.
Although he did always make sure that he related to his audience. And so he would pull out funny jokes or things that were very relatable. And so he usually started with something humorous to get the crowd kind of laughing and get any sort of tension out of their shoulders so they could just sit back and enjoy the rest of the speech.
Yeah. Coming from South Dakota, I can tell you that his giving a Republican a Republican speech on a Democratic platform on a farm in Iowa were really, really big.
Yes. Oh, he just had such a way of putting people at ease, that self-deprecating humor, making
Mm.
himself sometimes the butt of the joke. He never made jokes at the expense of others, but he often used humor to make very important points, and he used that masterfully. So, I think we've lost a lot of that capacity these days, which is unfortunate. And we don't need to go out and buy a joke book or anything, but we sometimes take ourselves a little too seriously. And could we add a little levity into the conversation that both sides can laugh at, not just making one side the object of poking fun? And maybe that would help us get to a place where we can all not take each other too seriously and get along a little better.
Yeah, the most famous line I think that he will have ever uttered, other than "tear down this wall," was that he will not make age an issue in this election. And
And at that moment, you saw the true professionalism of the actor. He delivered that line. He
oh,
let it sit there. He reached over. He took his glass of water, took a sip. And I mean, Mondale even was laughing so hard. If
oh
Mondale
yeah,
hadn't already lost, he lost in that moment because he
that was the
could
last moment of
not
his
stop
candidacy.
laughing. But again,
Yeah,
that's something that we knew the left was going after him about. And he took it and turned it into a positive moment. And,
yeah,
people always criticize, oh, I don't know how you could be an actor and be president. And he would turn that around and say, well, I don't know how you can be president and not be an actor. Not
yeah.
that he was acting a role, but he knew that performance mattered, timing mattered,
Mhm,
delivery mattered. And you had to present your ideas in a way that people could understand them, relate to them, repeat them, and evangelize for them. And if you couldn't deliver that in a way that it was these catchphrases, it's morning in America. He actually was the first president to say, make America great again. And so
mhm.
give people phrases that they can repeat, that they can wear as banners or slogans of their own identity and ideology. And he was so good at that. And we wanted to follow him.
Yeah, and he gave them to us to own, and they were simple, and I would say they were elegant in their simplicity,
Right.
not just a tagline. It was a concept and an idea rolled up into something that was easy to roll off the tongue.
Yeah. Well, he never spoke above people or beneath people. He spoke right to
Mhm,
people. And I think that comes from his great respect of all Americans. He was born in poverty in the heartland, middle of nowhere, Illinois. His father was an alcoholic. And if you looked at the cards of life he had been dealt, you probably would have said, this poor kid does not have a chance. But he was raised by a mother who was an incredible woman of faith who raised him to believe that anything was possible and that God had a plan for his life. And so, even though he eventually leaves the heartland of America, I think he's still always acknowledged that the heartland is the heartbeat of
yeah.
America. He never looked down on those people. He left the Midwest, but the Midwest never left him. And in his post presidency years, it was amazing. Anytime I saw somebody coming from Eureka College or Dixon, Illinois, I knew I had to clear a pretty large chunk of time on his calendar because those were people that mattered to him. And it wasn't just for photo op or publicity reasons. Those were people that he felt connected to, that they were part of who he was. And he was
Mhm.
never ashamed of that, but always was very proud to be from the Midwest and never forgot his people.
When you think about that in converse to today's vernacular of flyover country, how would you feel about
Yeah. It's interesting because as much, and we're not going to talk politics, but as much as Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan are very different, of course, in lots of ways, I would argue that both of them do have that deep appreciation for the common man, the
it?
hardworking
Mhm,
man. Donald Trump, raised in New York, obviously of means, much more than Ronald Reagan, but look how he made his money working with painters and plumbers and
building stuff.
bricklayers and housekeepers and people who knew how to build things, do things, make things. And so he wasn't insulated from people like that. And so I think
Mhm,
he went up through the ranks of business and then in politics knowing, relating, appreciating, and wanting to advocate for the average man. And so I think that the people who support Donald Trump and his policies, they have a new and greater appreciation for the heartland and for the Midwest, more so
mhm.
than maybe some of our past presidents prior and between Reagan and Trump have had.
And we got an actor.
Exactly. I know. And anytime people criticize Donald Trump, who do I say, just remember, like, first he was an entertainer. And
Yeah.
so it is that, performance aspect and sometimes trying to get
Yeah,
a reaction based on performance. And he certainly does that well.
for sure. What are some of those? What's maybe one or two of those quiet moments where you looked across? I mean, your office, like you're right next to the president of the United States, or former president of the United States. But in my heart, he'll always be president of the United States.
I
What are
agree.
some
I'm
of
a
those?
little partial.
Thank you. I feel good about that. What are some of those moments where you remember where you thought where you were just in awe of him?
Yeah. There were countless moments. You obviously have to read my book, give a little promo to, the
There
president
we
will see you
go. There
now.
we go.
But there were those moments of just sitting at my desk, and from my desk, I could actually lean just a little bit and look at him sitting at his desk, which was great because I could keep, tabs on timing and if he needed anything. But there were countless pinch me moments where I just thought, how on earth does a young woman from Southern California who isn't politically connected, not of the donor class, has no experience in the political arena, be plucked from obscurity and dropped at the feet of greatness? And there were countless moments like that. And, Ronald Reagan had an incredible Only in America story. And I felt
Mhm.
like even the fact that I wound up in a place like that, that is my Only in America story. Only in America does something like that happen. And while there were certainly many moments of just being in awe of him and the surroundings, I also knew I had a job to do. And so I was
Yeah.
always very mindful of taking those snapshots in my mind. And really, those snapshots in my mind, that was the essence of my book. Because all these years later, when I'm writing about something that happened so long ago, I went back to those snapshots. And as you probably saw in the book, hopefully you felt like I had glasses on and you were looking through the lens of the glasses at exactly what I was seeing and feeling and witnessing. So I would take those snapshots in my mind very intentionally. And then it was back to looking at my watch and checking the clock and what was his schedule and what was the timing and
Yeah.
anticipating if we're leaving and the briefing papers and Secret Service and just coordinating 1,000 things. But there's sort of feeling like that duck on the top of the water. You just smooth sailing on the top and
And
underneath the sea, you're just
paddle like crazy.
paddling crazy. But it was
Yeah.
always such an honor and a privilege to serve him. I never felt afraid that he was going to get angry at me, but I also didn't ever want to disappoint him. A great leadership trait was, he chose this very young woman to work for him, to serve and support him. And I felt like he gave me his trust and his loyalty probably even before I had earned it. And
Mm.
that made me want to give him my respect and my loyalty. And it made me want to work so hard for him. And I thought, what a great leadership style, not demanding respect or demanding loyalty, but giving it first. And then it comes back tenfold
Yeah.
because you haven't demanded it, you've earned it.
One of the things that we talk about in the multi-generational speeches is that is respect earned or is it given? And I maintain that if you earn it before it's given and you give it before it's earned, you're probably in a much better place. And people are going to get along a
Yeah.
lot better with you.
Yeah.
It
You
sounds
definitely
like you
try
have
to
the
earn
same
it
thought.
when it is given to you first. You do try to earn it, and
Hmm.
because he had done that, I not that I would ever not have worked hard, but it made me want to work incredibly hard for him. I never wanted to let his legacy lag or jeopardize his life or his reputation or make a mistake that would reflect poorly on him. And so that
Hmm.
wasn't because he made me feel afraid, but I just had this personal feeling of loyalty to him that I never wanted to let him down.
Yeah. Now, you've spent some pretty significant time at the ranch as well, have you known?
Yes. So the Reagan Ranch, we went up there
Yes.
numerous times. So hosted Margaret Thatcher, hosted Mikhail Gorbachev, and countless other people. But those are definitely some memorable visits. Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada. And so Ronald Reagan used to love to go up there. He used to love to invite people to visit him there. And if you know anything about the Reagan Ranch, it is very primitive and it's a
Hmm.
little adobe house. It was built at the end of the 1800s. It had no central air or heat. It had a fireplace and fans. It
Yeah.
was pictured like grandma's house, little cabin on top of the hill. But he loved it. And so he loved hosting people there. And if they were expecting some palatial presidential retreat, this definitely was not that. But
And not even a good road.
you really saw Ronald Reagan come alive there, though. He loved it. And you saw that at his heart, he loved America. He loved the land. He called it his
Mm.
open cathedral. He would get out on horseback and ride around. And, that was his time to connect to his God, to clear his head, to, pray and to worship the beauty of that place and to give thanks to God for the opportunity to serve as president and to just enjoy the beauty of nature.
Mhm. Now, are you able to stay in touch with the rest of the family at all at this point?
I have a little bit
Is-
of touch periodically with the family. And in fact, if I can give you a little preview of something I'm working on, you
okay.
talked about you're working
This-
on your fourth book. I'm actually working on a second book right now. The working title is Raising Reagan: How Nellie Reagan in the Midwest Shaped the Man Who Changed the World. And it's about
oh,
Ronald Reagan's
wow.
mother, who he always called the
Sure.
most important person in his early life. And so she was very influential on him and obviously on his children as well, passing along her faith, her love of country. And there's
Mm.
been little snippets done here and there of her, but I'm going to do a comprehensive look at her life, and not just the totality of her life, but the fingerprints of her life that we saw evident in her son long after she was gone. And I'll make the argument too that at the end of his life, even when Alzheimer's hits, when you take away the pomp and circumstance of being president, what you're left with are the very seeds that Nellie planted: a love of God,
Mm.
a love and service of others, a love of this country. And so she was
Yeah.
a very large figure in his life. And I'm excited to learn more and tell more about her story.
All right. Well, Grampian Nation, you heard it here first. We got our first scoop from Peggy Grande. One of the things, Peggy, that I long to do is go to the presidential Ronald Reagan presidential library. Can you tell us a bit about just a thumbnail about that?
Yeah, it's amazing. Ronald Reagan's library in particular, and I would encourage your listeners, go to see all the presidential libraries. I think there's 14 of them across the nation. They're incredible repositories of history, and they take you back to that time if it's not a
Mhm.
time you remember, or it puts you in that time frame if it's a time you don't remember. But Ronald Reagan's library in particular is uniquely amazing because it starts with his childhood, of course, and then it goes to a gallery that talks all about his Hollywood years. And for most
Mm.
people, making 50 something movies in Hollywood would be the peak of their career. But
Yeah.
you leave this small gallery of 50 something movies that he made, and you go into a larger gallery. And there we revisit the fact that he was governor of the state of California for 8 years. And again, for most people, that would be the pinnacle of their
Oh,
career.
sure.
California, the fifth or sixth largest economy in the entire world, and to govern it for 8 years is a massive accomplishment. But then you leave that gallery and you realize that there was a whole life ahead of him. And I don't know how many grandpas listen to the Grampian, but Ronald Reagan changed what retirement looks like for me,
Hmm.
for probably lots of people, because at almost the age of 70, rather than renting a motorhome and driving cross country, which no criticism of that for anybody, but
Yeah.
instead he decides to do and run for the most important role, not only of his lifetime, but in the nation. And
Yeah.
so he lived as much life as he could, as long as he could, as best as he could. And at a time when a lot of people are taking their foot off the throttle, he throttled in. He leaned
Yeah.
into the biggest and best and most important role of his entire life. And so the rest of the museum goes into the 8 years of the Reagan
Mm.
presidency, starting again with the Carter economy that he inherited and really talking about how he turned that around. And then, galleries that talk about the Cold War, and you realize that the Berlin Wall was very much a presence in the world at that time, and how bold he was to stand there and tell Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And even though the wall didn't come down until a few years after he left office, Ronald Reagan certainly put that into motion. And
Yeah.
so it's just this beautiful story. And then, of course, the last gallery, we say goodbye to him. And there's beautiful tributes from Brian
Mm.
Mulrooney, from President George Bush, from Lady Margaret Thatcher, who recorded a a tribute to him, not knowing, because she was in declining health, not knowing if she would be able to make a speech at that time or would be able to attend. And so she recorded this beautiful tribute to him. And in that gallery, we all have that feeling and that emotion of where we were when we heard that he had passed away, and we felt like a part of America was gone.
Yeah.
And as George Bush said, some with the passing of Ronald Reagan, some of America's best days are behind us, and that's worthy of our tears. And I thought that was a beautiful way of talking about the grief that I think we collectively as a nation all felt. But you see the beautiful turnout, the tributes along the streets, people stopping their cars, lining on the freeways, bringing signs, hanging flags, laying flowers, and you realize that this nation loved this man, and that man had loved our nation as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that I don't think he gets credit for, even in the from a historical perspective, because of the timing of it. I graduated from high school in 1977, and really going into service, going in the military, was not a very good option at that point. And yet, 4 years later, it was a great job.
Right.
And he is responsible for that. And so he really did, in many ways, turn around the mindset of America.
Yeah, he did. And I know so many people, and I'm sure you do too, who joined the military just during the Reagan buildup. And they signed up to serve this country and this president because he made them, again, feel proud. He made them feel like that was a noble calling and that our nation needed and wanted brave men and women to step up and sign up and serve, and that would be a worthy, noble calling that he would back up. We had seen previously there was so much negativity toward people who had served previously that Reagan promised that he would make them proud to serve. And we saw peace through strength and how important that was to him. And we see a lot of that narrative being used today as well. But it was so true. We will never have peace unless we're strong first. And we need to be strong. And he created a vision for what strength would look like. And we saw the peace that was able to come because we were strong.
Yeah. And even places like Martin Marietta in Denver, the military contractor, they put peace through strength over the gate, but right prior to his visit. And so it was pretty cool.
Yeah. And, Reagan's mindset of peace through strength, yes, it was military strength, but it was also economic strength. And that was one of the ways that he really put pressure, especially on the Russian economy. He knew it was a house of cards that was ready to fall over, but he knew that America had to be strong economically in order to be strong militarily, and that it had to be robust and strong from the inside as well as the outside. And so, again, we see, I think, a lot of that playing out today, where there's this focus on economic strength and power as well as military might.
Hand in hand. Certainly. So, Peggy, we got to land this airplane here sometime, and it's not Air Force One, but we're going to do that. But before we go, we first want to say thank you. You've been so gracious with your time. But you've lived a big life. I mean, coming from Pepperdine, kudos to Pepperdine. There we go. I got it in. Coming from Pepperdine as a kid, you rose literally to the halls of greatness, and I just couldn't be more thrilled and proud to have you in the program. But someone helped you along the way, and at the Grampian, we always give kudos and maybe a high five to someone who affected your journey in such a significant way that you can't help but give a proud partner. Who is your champion, Peggy Grande?
Well, I feel like it's going to be, the Jesus answer in Sunday school that the kid says Jesus for every question they get asked.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm going to use the Ronald Reagan card only because he was somebody that affected my life in very personal ways. And so he wasn't just somebody I admired from afar. I learned everything I will ever need to know from that man. And if I can divert one quick second, I guess when I was young, I thought you had to choose. Am I going to be strong and successful or a kind, good person? And he really changed that narrative. And he showed me that you can be strong and successful, never give in on your principles, but also be a kind, good person. And so he forever changed the trajectory of what I embraced leadership as looking like. And he also taught me the power of words and backing those words up with action, and that the right words matter and that listening matters, to your point. And if I can help us land, I would love to leave you with a Reagan quote because he always says it better than me.
Please do.
At the 1992 Republican National Convention, he left us with, at the time, we didn't know it would be one of his last major public speeches, but he kind of left us with a roadmap of how he wanted to be remembered. And he said to us, whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, may it say that I appealed to your best hopes, not to your worst fears, to your confidence rather than your doubts. And so much of politics today, what do? They divide us. They appeal to our fears. They appeal to our doubts. But we as leaders, whether or not we're in the political arena, we can do it the Reagan way and lead where you're appealing to people's confidence and to their best hopes. And he did that so beautifully. And I'm forever grateful to him for the opportunity to see what leadership at the highest and best looks like and how you can appeal to people's hopes and confidence and just incredibly encourage them to be part of the great leadership journey that you're laying a vision out for.
Wow.
So thank you so much.
Gipper, thank you for training Peggy Grande in because you did a great job. And we are looking forward to your title. Give the title again to your second book. It's called
Raising Reagan, How Nellie Reagan in the Midwest Shaped the Man Who Changed the World. It'll be about a year or so before it comes out, but
we're looking for that. In the meantime, folks, go on Amazon. The president will see you now. And I promise you, even if you listen to it, and Peggy, you read it too. So you're an official Amazon narrator, Audible narrator. So good on you. I just want to say thank you again for coming in and stopping by and talking to the Grampian Nation. And by the way, Grampian Nation, you keep living those Grampian dreams. This is Jim.
When you get an opportunity, subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcast.